Let's set the scene. It is Europe, 1914. This big country called Austria-Hungary and this tiny country called Serbia are very, very angry at each other. You see, Serbia was a very nationalistic country, made almost entirely up of Slavic peoples. On the other hand, Austria-Hungary was an extremely diverse country made up of all these different cultures. When you have such a massive country with all of these cultures, major problems are sure to arise. And in the case of Austria-Hungary, problems arose in this area called Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was mostly made up of Serbs and Croats. Bosnia and Herzegovina had been a subject of the Ottoman Empire since 1481, but decided to revolt in 1875 due to unfair taxes, repression of Christianity, and growing influence from other Slavic neighbors such as Serbia. The revolution caused widespread war throughout the Balkans, leading to the 1878 Congress of Berlin, which put Bosnia and Herzegovina under the control of Austria-Hungary. Serbia was extremely upset about the arrangement, however, as they viewed the whole point of the rebellion as a way for the Slavic people to rise up against their Ottoman oppressors. Tensions rose even further when Bosnia and Herzegovina was annexed by Austria-Hungary. Radical Serbs felt they had to do something, and so the Black Hand was born. The Black Hand was a terror group aimed at uniting all Serbs throughout the Balkans. Another revolutionary cell in the Balkans at the time was the Young Bosnians, made up mainly of university students from Bosnia and Herzegovina. In 1914, news spread throughout the Balkans that Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was to attend a series of military exercises in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Young Bosnians and the Black Hand viewed this as the perfect opportunity to strike, so they worked together to plan an assassination of the Archduke. 7 assassins were positioned throughout Bosnia and Herzegovina's capital, Sarajevo, on the morning of June 28, 1914. Ferdinand had been warned of the possibility of an assassination attempt, and yet still decided to keep the top of their car open. The first 2 assassins chickened out, but the third, named Nedeljko Čebrinović, threw a bomb at Ferdinand's car, which missed and hit the car of soldiers in front of him. Now, instead of doing the logical thing, and maybe getting the frick out of there, Ferdinand decides, gee, how about instead I don't do that and drive to the hospital to visit the injured soldiers? I see absolutely no harm coming out of this decision. As you can probably guess, harm came out of that decision. On their way to the hospital, the 3 cars guiding Ferdinand took a wrong turn and coincidentally ended up right where one of the assassins, Gavrila Princip, was. From there, it was just a matter of pulling the trigger. Unlike the other assassins, however, Princip did not chicken out and did not miss. He fired 2 shots at Ferdinand, one hitting him in the neck and another hitting his wife Sophie in the abdomen. Both died minutes after. Serbia! What do you want, you slimy Austro-Hungarian imperialist pig? I mean, my wonderful and trusting neighbor. A terrorist group, basically in charge of your government, just murdered our Archduke. Okay, cool. What? No, what's wrong with you? Well, you guys basically kidnapped my best friend, so I don't know what you expected me to do. I don't know, maybe not murder people? You didn't even have that cool mustache anyway. What did you just say? The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand resulted in the declaration of war against Serbia by Austria-Hungary and its ally, Germany, on July 28, 1914. Serbia was not alone, however, as their ally, Russia, aligned with them and declared war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. In the early stages of the war, much of Western Europe viewed the conflict as region-wide, and weren't particularly concerned about it spreading to them. That was until, in their usual fashion, Germany started invading everyone. You see, Germany had been hoping and waiting for a war for many years. As early as 1905, Germany had been planning a way to invade France, destroy the Triple Entente, and become the main power of Europe, known as the Schlieffen Plan. Another major reason for Germany being so eager to fight in the war had to do with their navy. The Triple Entente basically controlled trade on the seas, and Germany got a little bit jealous. The possibility of war spreading throughout Europe was becoming more and more likely by the day, and it all reached a boiling point when Germany invaded neutral Belgium, causing Great Britain to declare war on them. There was no turning back now. The first battle of World War I took place at the Belgian city of Liège on August 4th, 1914. The day after, Britain would declare war. The Germans were able to take the city, and soon after the entire country, murdering innocent civilians and even a priest they claimed was conspiring with Belgian rebels. The Germans eventually made their way to France, taking the French countryside almost as easily as they had taken Belgium. Meanwhile, Paris was in chaos. Thousands of people fled the city. Works of art were taken down from the Louvre to be transported safely to Toulouse, and the military general of the city, Joseph Simon Gaillani, proclaimed that if action wasn't taken soon, the city would be captured by September 5th. Luckily for the French, this idiot with a funny name named Alexander von Kluck was in charge of the German First Army. Instead of listening to directions from his superiors and supporting the Second Army in case of a French attack, von Kluck made his exhausted forces march towards Paris so they could take it and he could get all the glory. What ended up happening instead was the French army finding a flank in von Kluck's army near the Marne River and pushing them back north. The First Battle of the Marne was an Allied victory, but ended up leading to one of the most brutal and bloody military tactics our world has ever seen: trench warfare. In trying to outflank each other, both sides dug trenches spanning from Switzerland all the way to the North Sea, which would harbor fighting for the rest of the war. And this wasn't just any fighting. Trench warfare was exceptionally bloody, and thousands of soldiers died just to gain a few meters of land. It would go like this. One side would absolutely pummel the other one with bullets from machine guns and soldiers, while the side being shot at would attack until they either gave up or took the enemy trench. In between the trenches lay what was known as no man's land, filled with barbed wire, mud, and poisonous water. Living in the trenches was no fun either, as you had to endure rats, corpses, and mud. Lots and lots of mud. Due to the horrendous conditions, many soldiers fighting received PTSD, or shell-shocked as they called it during the war. Throughout the rest of 1914, attempts on both sides to turn the war in their favor were made, but met with failure. If you think this war is a lot already, then you ain't seen nothing yet, son, because we still have a whole nother front going on in the east. Can you guess what this front is called? Is it A, the Eastern-Western Front, B, the other front, C, the Nile River, or D, the Eastern Front? If you said D, you would be correct. If not, I would suggest professional help. Instead of waiting for the inevitable German attack, the Russians struck first and won a decisive victory at Gumbinnen, taking parts of the German province of East Prussia. Unfortunately for the Russians, however, the Germans would strike back at the Battle of Tannenberg and were able to destroy the entire Russian Second Army led by Alexander Samsonov due to ingenious tactics by this grumpy pants named Erich Ludendorff. The Russian First Army, led by Paul von Ribbentrop, was repelled from East Russia as well, meaning Russia's campaigns in the region were largely ineffective. Now that the Russian campaigns in East Prussia had been suppressed, Germany focused its efforts on aiding Austria-Hungary in their war efforts in the region of Silesia. Initial efforts were in vain, however, as Russia was almost fully mobilized and had a massive influx of troopers. Thanks to more ingenious tactics by Erich Ludendorff and another general with a funny mustache named Paul von Hindenburg, the German and Austro-Hungarian forces were able to push the Russians back to the Nida and Dunajec rivers, where they would bunker down and dig trenches. Meanwhile, a new development was being made in the south of the Eastern Front. A new country was about to join the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, adding to the mighty Central Powers. That country was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans had slowly been declining over the years. A pro-war faction in the Ottoman government called the Young Turks, led by this guy named Enver Pasha, believed that siding with Germany would rejuvenate the empire and ensure security from Russia. So, he went behind the back of the Ottoman government and signed a treaty with Germany on August 2nd, 1914, pledging that the Ottomans would join the Germans and Austro-Hungarians in case of a war against Russia. The Ottoman government was extremely upset at Pasha for signing the treaty without permission, but there wasn't really much they could do. The deal had already been put in writing, and even the military supported Germany, as it included some German officials. Another reason for the Ottomans joining the Central Powers also had to do with their admiration of Germany. Many high-ranking Ottoman army officials had attended staff colleges in Germany, and many in the empire viewed Germany as having the greatest army in the world. The Ottomans officially joined the war on October 29, 1914, when they would attack Odessa and other Russian port cities using 2 boats given to them by Germany. Russia declared war, and soon after, the rest of the Allies. Throughout the rest of 1914 and 1915, the Ottomans would fight Allied forces in the Middle East and the Caucasus region. Meanwhile, yet another front was being fought in Africa. You see, Germany had these colonies in Africa, and the Allies were eager to steal them. French forces from Dahomey and British forces from the Gold Coast conquered German Togoland with ease, but faced issues in German Cameroon, which they were eventually able to capture in February of 1916. In southern Africa, the British were able to capture German Southwest Africa, but faced rebellion that did not end until July of 1915. Knock knock, who's there? It's Japan, and they're taking all of Germany's colonies in the Pacific, and even invading parts of China, because why not? Japan had joined the war near its beginning in hopes of increasing its influence in the Pacific, as they were building an empire of themselves as well. Germany also faced opposition in their holdings of Western Samoa, New Pommern, and German New Guinea from Australian and New Zealand forces. Germany's luck with their colonies was looking pretty bad. Luckily, though, they had this guy with the funny hat, Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. Lettow-Vorbeck was given a pretty small force of troopers numbering about 14,000, with 11,000 of which being untrained native Africans. Despite this, however, Leto Vorbeck was able to fight a three-front war against British, Belgian, and Portuguese colonies, whose forces numbered more than 300,000, with incredible military strategy and the use of guerrilla warfare. Leto Vorbeck was such a good general, in fact, that he never lost a battle over the course of the entire war. He was able to pull off an invasion of Portuguese East Africa and northern Rhodesia, but had to surrender due to the war's end on November 25, 1918. In January of 1915, Russia was getting increasingly worried about the growing Ottoman presence in the Caucasus, and asked the Allies to do something about them. So, the British began to plan an invasion of Ottoman territory starting at the Gallipoli Peninsula, and, if all went to plan, ending in the capture of Constantinople. Unfortunately for the Allies, however, the campaign went horribly wrong for a multitude of reasons. Firstly, the Allies, mainly composed of soldiers from Britain and its overseas colonies and some French forces, vastly underestimated the Ottoman resistance. The campaign officially began on February 16, 1915, when Allied bombardment of the Ottoman coast began, but was repelled due to strong Ottoman defense. Not only was the bombardment a big whoopsie-poopsie, but it also took away all surprise of an Allied attack, which would come later on April 25, 1915. French forces launched a divisionary attack on Kumkale, while British, Australian, Indian, and New Zealand forces launched invasions of beaches on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The Ottomans and the Allies would remain in a tight deadlock for the rest of the year, with attempts being made on both sides to repel or attack the other side. Eventually, trenches were dug, and the same horrors witnessed on the Western Front were transferred over to this front. Hundreds of thousands of Allied and Ottoman soldiers died within the few months-long campaign, and the British government had had enough. For months, the general in charge of the campaign, Sir Ian Hamilton, had insisted that the British be able to take Constantinople and knock the Ottomans out of the war. All that the British saw, however, was death, destruction, and chaos occurring at Gallipoli, and ordered Hamilton to withdraw. No. Excuse me? No. Hamilton, you're being a very bad boy. I don't care. I haven't had any cuddles and outside times today, so I'm mad. Hamilton, go to the timeout corner. Very bad boy. You bad boy. You're in charge now. Do I get outside time and cuddles? Maybe, but probably not the last part. Yay. Hamilton had been given the boot by Parliament, and his replacement, Lieutenant General Sir Charles Monro, immediately evacuated all British and colonial forces from the peninsula, meaning the Ottomans were victorious. Both sides suffered immense losses, however, with the Allies having casualties almost half of their 500,000 men deployed to Gallipoli, and the Ottomans having a similar amount to the Allies as well. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, it was becoming increasingly apparent that this war was not going to be one that could be easily won. Both sides developed new technologies to subdue their enemies, to varying degrees of success. For the British, it was a big armored boom-boom machine called a tank, while the Germans developed a type of warfare that many viewed as cruel: chemical warfare. Chemical warfare was first used by the Germans at the Battle of Pres from April to May of 1915. The specific gas used during the battle was poisonous chlorine, which would get into the lungs of soldiers without gas masks and suffocate them to death. Another brutal gas method was the use of mustard gas, which caused severe burns and blistering even through the clothes of soldiers. The implementation of chemical warfare only added to the horrors of the war and the downright atrocious living conditions faced by soldiers during the war. In September of 1915, the Allies launched a major counterattack against the Germans at Loo, which was easily defeated due to, yet again, a lack of surprise. Before the battle began, the Allies launched massive bombardments using their newly improved artillery, which was another innovation perfected during the war, leaving the Germans with time to call upon additional reserves to fight. The Battle of Loo also marked the first use of Allied chemical warfare, where British soldiers set up cylinders filled with chlorine gas to unleash upon the German trenches. Unfortunately for the British, the wind was blowing in the opposite direction, so they ended up attacking their own trenches with poisonous gas. Great job, guys. The Germans were able to repel the attack and won the battle, losing around 25,000 men compared to the Allied 50,000. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Russia was getting its booty absolutely kicked by the Germans thanks to this guy named August von Mackensen, who had the coolest hat of them all. Mackensen was able to push the Russians 80 miles from their encampments at the Dunajec River to the Sand River in only around a month, an incredible achievement for a war that seemed extremely stationary up to this point. Russia was really close to getting knocked out of the war, until another counterattack was launched by the Germans, with this one being unsuccessful. The plan was for troops under the command of Paul von Hindenburg coming from East Prussia to intersect with troops under Mackensen at the Russian Bulge in Warsaw. The plan didn't work due to Russian forces holding back Mackensen's forces at Brest-Litovsk and Hindenburg's forces being held along the Naru River. Eventually, Germany was able to capture all of Russian Poland, and around 750,000 Russian soldiers were taken captive. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire started to face major losses in their campaign in the Caucasus. In response, the Ottoman government blamed the ethnic Armenians living in the region, who were allied with the Russians, and began a state-sponsored campaign of genocide against them. Over the course of the next few years, 600,000 to 1.5 million Armenians were killed, most of which being civilians. At the same time of the genocide, the Ottomans were also occupied with British opposition in Egypt and Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, the British had been advancing hundreds of miles into Ottoman territory since their capture of the Persian port city of Basra in November of 1914. Luckily for the Ottomans, the British retreated to the city of Kut after their defeat at the Battle of Tesfun in November of 1915. At Kut, the British surrendered their force of 10,000 to the Ottomans on April 29, 1916, often considered to be one of, if not the most crippling losses and embarrassing ones for the Allies during the war. On the other side of the Middle East, the British were fighting the Ottomans over the control of the strategic Sinai Peninsula and supported numerous rebellions against Ottoman rule in the region of Hejaz. Well, look who finally decided to join the war: Italy. Italy had been allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary since 1882, but it had not joined the war until April 26, 1915, when they signed an agreement with the Triple Entente. The treaty stated that if Italy joined the war on the side of the Allies, they would get the cities of Trieste, Trentino, Gorizia, alongside the regions of South Tyrol, the Istrian Peninsula, and some of northern Dalmatia. Now, Italy. Will your territorial ambitions really be enough to betray your longtime best friend just to give me the territory? And so, on May 23, 1915, Italy declared war on Austria-Hungary, effectively bringing them into World War I. Italy started out fast, sending troops under General Luigi Cadorna eastward towards the province of Venetia into Austro-Hungarian territory just days after declaring war. Throughout 1915 and 1916, 6 attempts, 5 additional ones were made past 1916, were made to break the deadlock between the Austro-Hungarian and Italian forces, known as the Battles of the Isonzo, with each one usually ending with an Italian defeat or a stalemate. Austria-Hungary was also seeing victories on their Serbian front, which was reignited on October 6, 1915, when Austro-Hungarian and German forces crossed the Danube into Serbian territory alongside their new ally, Bulgaria, who attacked from the east. To avoid being completely surrounded on both sides, the Serbian army continued retreating westward until they stopped at the island of Corfu off the coast of Greece. An Allied counterattack was launched in the spring of 1916, but to no avail due to strong resistance from the Central Powers. With all this action going on all these different fronts, Germany saw a massive opportunity to puncture the deadlock on the Western Front and take France once and for all. The attack began on February 21, 1916, at the extremely strategic town of Verdun. The attack started off well for the Germans, who took one of the town's most important forts, Fort Douaumont, on February 25th. Despite heavy French resistance, the Germans continued and were able to take another fort, Fort Vaux, and were close to Verdun itself until a massive Allied counterattack was launched on July 1, 1916, known as the Somme Offensive. The Somme Offensive, however, was a major failure for the Allies, as the British command, led by Sir Douglas Haig, underestimated their foes, again leading to a massive loss of life. In fact, the Somme Offensive led to so many deaths and such a little gain of land that a clear victory isn't attributed to either side. It is viewed as more of a stalemate than a victory for one faction or the other. The only thing it really did well was distract German forces from Verdun, who withdrew after intense fighting in December of 1916. Now, for the majority of this video, we have been discussing conflicts that have taken place on land. But World War I was not just a terrestrial war. Many skirmishes and battles took place on sea, especially between Germany and Britain's big, beautiful navies. The naval engagement between the two countries was very complicated, but boiled down to 2 main objectives for each side. 1. To limit trade with each side's allies, and 2. To destroy as much of the other side's navy as possible. The first objective often led to the second objective, and vice versa. Britain began the fighting with the Battle of Heligoland Bight, which ended in a British victory. From there, Germany mainly deployed its submarines in European waters and other ships abroad in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. That was until 1915, when Germany started to rely completely on submarines due to damages caused to their normal ships. On February 4th of that same year, Germany announced that any ship trading with Britain or any of the other allies would be sunk no matter what side they were on. This really ruffled the feathers of countries such as the United States, who may or may not have been selling arms to Britain over the course of the war. Things reached a boiling point on May 7, 1915, when the British cruise liner, the RMS Lusitania, was sunk, which may or may not have been carrying American arms. Another American thing on that ship was civilians, and the Lusitania had a lot of them, 128 to be exact. The American public was outraged and demanded war, but President Woodrow Wilson insisted on maintaining the isolationist ideology that had been guiding the U.S. throughout the war, and so refused to declare war on Germany. Germany was not just sinking civilian ships, however, they were also fighting, and the largest of these fights came on May 31st, 1915 at the Jutland Peninsula. The German plan, concocted by Admiral Reinhard Scheer, had German vessels taking off from the German port of Wilhelmshaven and meeting British vessels off the coast of Rosyth, Scotland, led by Admiral David Beatty. The Germans then hoped that the British Grand Fleet, led by Admiral John Jellicoe, would sail from northern Scotland to assist Beatty's forces at Rosyth, where the German Navy could then wreak havoc, thereby destroying the British Navy. Luckily for the British, codebreakers were able to figure out the plan and preparations were made for the German attack. On the day of the attack, Beatty withdrew his forces from Rosyth and met up with Jellicoe's at Jutland, and the ensuing battle cost thousands of lives and the irreparable damage of multiple major ships on both sides. In the end, the battle was considered a stalemate, but asserted British dominance in the North Sea for the rest of the war. Going back to the war on land, Russia and Italy both launched battles aimed at distracting the German advance into Verdun in March of 1916, with Russia's being an attack on Lake Narok and Italy's being yet another offensive on the Isonzo River. Russia's offensive failed, but it didn't matter, as a larger offensive was being planned for the summer. The offensive involved three armies, one under Alexei Brusilov attacking from the south, another under Alexei Kuropatkin in the north, and the last one under Alexei Everts centrally. I think I'm starting to sense kind of a theme here. Alexei Brusilov's attack was meant as more of a diversion from Kuropatkin and Everts' offensive, but it ended up becoming the largest attack and Russia's last major one of the war. Brusilov's forces attacked on June 4, 1916, and immediately took the cities of Lutsk and Chernivtsi in the same month, taking around 200,000 prisoners. Brusilov's forces had also made it as far east as the Carpathian Mountains when the offensive ended due to a German counterattack in Lutsk under the biggest grumpy pants of them all, Alexander von Linsingen. Brusilov's offensive had been a success in gaining land for the Russians, but its cost was unparalleled. 1 million Russian soldiers deserted or were taken prisoner, lowering the already tiny Russian morale. The offensive had also given false hope to Romania, who decided against better judgment to enter the war on the side of the Allies on August 27, 1916. Romania had hoped that with all the different fronts going on, the Central Powers wouldn't be too focused on them, and they could help invade Germany and Austria-Hungary. But boy, were they wrong. General and ex-chief of the German General Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, started drafting up plans for an invasion of Romania just a day after their declaration of war. Forces under August von Mackensen invaded first, taking the town of Tutrakan and threatening the region of Dobruja. Due to Mackensen's presence in the east, the Romanian army placed most of their troops there instead of fortifying their border with Austria-Hungary. Falkenhayn viewed that as the perfect opportunity to strike and invaded. Within 2 months, the Central Powers were able to take Bucharest and knock Romania out of the war. Meanwhile, tensions between the United States and Germany were at an all-time high. Germany had decided to reinstate their unrestricted submarine warfare policy and placed this guy, Arthur Zimmermann, in charge of foreign affairs in November of 1916. At the same time, tensions between Mexico and the United States were high as well. But relations between the United States and the Allies were at an all-time high for no particular reason. Germany was feeling intimidated, and Zimmermann had an idea. On January 16, 1917, a telegram was sent to the German ambassador in Mexico proposing an alliance between the two nations and an invasion of the United States by Mexico. Before the telegram could reach Mexico, however, it was intercepted by the British Navy. The U.S. was livid, and President Woodrow Wilson prepared the country for war. And war did end up coming on April 6, 1917. Meanwhile, major changes were being made on the Western Front after the failure of the Battle of the Somme. Britain's Prime Minister, H.H. Asquith, resigned from his position and was replaced by Chancellor David Lloyd George, while French Commander-in-Chief, José Joffre, was replaced with Commander Robert Nivelle. As soon as Nivelle took the job, he started to prepare for a major offensive. His plan was that small British forces would attack north and south of the old Somme battlefield, drawing out the German forces. Then, the combined French and British forces would launch the offensive in the region of Champagne. You silly billies. Not that Champagne. We don't allow that here at the Barnesville School of Arts and Sciences. News of the Allied offensive reached the German command, now led by Ludendorff and Hindenburg, who massively reinforced their lines. The British attacked the Germans at the city of Arras on April 9, 1917, and were victorious. But the French at Champagne were not as lucky. The strong German defense caused mass chaos and confusion on the Allied lines, resulting in a gain of only about 600 yards compared to the French estimate of 6 miles. Eventually, the French realized, hey, wait a minute, 3,000 people dying to gain 6 yards of land? That doesn't sound very cool. And so the French army mutinied. The mutiny was only put down when Robert Nivelle was taken out of his position and replaced by Verdun hero Philippe Pétain. Compared to Nivelle, Pétain's tactics were much more defensive and careful, leading to much admiration from his troops, who had beforehand just been basically lambs to a slaughterhouse under Nivelle. Just months after the American entry into the war, a revolution led by this guy, who this face-app apparently thinks I look like, knocked Russia out of the war, meaning that all focus was now on the Western Front. Sir, the Austro-Hungarians are killing us in the thousands. Our last 10 battles on the Isonzo River have been overwhelming failures, and the morale of our troops is at an all-time low. I don't know, go launch another offensive on the Isonzo or something. Sir, the offensive, it actually worked. But that's not possible. Well, we made it possible, sir. I can't believe this is actually happening. Sir? Sir? After 10 battles at the Isonzo, the Italians had finally broken the deadlock with the Austro-Hungarians, who started to plan an offensive in response to the Italian breakthrough. The offensive was led by German General Otto von Below, and was able to push the Italians back to the Piave River north of Venice, resulting in an astonishing 500,000 casualties, with a further 250,000 being taken prisoner. So basically, as soon as the Italians won, they lost. In response, the Italian government fired Cadorna, realizing finally that a general who loses 10 battles in a row is usually not too competent, and appointed this handsome man named Armando Diaz. Going back to Mesopotamia, the British started to pay more attention to the front after the embarrassing defeat at Kut in April of 1916, and appointed Sir Frederick Stanley Maude as the leader of the British forces in the region. Maude immediately got to work, advancing up the Tigris River until the British had reached Kut yet again on February 22, 1917. 2 days later, the British were able to capture the city. Maude didn't stop there, though, as his troops continued to advance and were eventually able to take the extremely important city of Baghdad on March 11, 1917. Within the span of only a few months, the Mesopotamian front had been turned around in favor of the British, who were also seeing major victories on their Palestinian front. The same could not be said on the Western Front, however, where another failed offensive was launched by General Sir Douglas Haig, but only led to a small gain of land and hundreds of thousands more British casualties, thanks in large part to the horribly muddy conditions of the Belgian region of Flanders. By 1918, both sides were exhausted, but were gaining momentum due to the influx of troops coming from America for the Allies and from the Eastern Front for the Central Powers. Ludendorff started planning another offensive in the hopes that he could knock the Allies out of the war before the bulk of American soldiers could arrive. The offensive, codenamed Operation Michael, would target the weakest link of the Allied line, the 47-mile stretch between the towns of Arras and La Fère along the Oise River. Operation Michael was launched on March 21, 1918, and did not go exactly as Ludendorff had anticipated. The German 18th Army, led by Oskar von Hutier, had advanced just fine through the Allied forces into south of the Somme, but the German forces at Arras faced a strong British resistance. Instead of capitalizing off the success of the 18th Army, Ludendorff decided to focus all of his troops on attacking the city of Amiens. The Allies, who were not prepared after the initial shock of the German offensive, were able to hold off the Germans just east of the city. Still, Operation Michael was a big victory for the Germans, who gained the most land since the beginning of the war in 1914. Now, you may be saying, well, how are the Allies going to win now? Germans have taken all its territory. The Allies still haven't done anything besides be on the defensive. To that, my dear viewer, I say be quiet and let me talk. True, the Germans were looking very strong and dangerous, but the cost of these offensives was staggering. 800,000 German casualties were inflicted, while Germany itself was depleting its resources at an alarming rate. Meanwhile, the Germans had failed to conquer vital Allied railways, meaning that supplies and troops kept on coming to the Western Front. All the Allies needed to do now was wait for another offensive to occur and pounce. And that offensive came on July 15th, 1918, in the form of the Second Battle of the Marne. German forces were repelled while trying to take the city of Chalon-sur-Marne and the town of Epernay, and were pushed back to the Aisne River. Not wanting to lose the advantage, an attack by the British Fourth Army, known as the Battle of Amiens, was launched on August 8th, 1918, and it was absolutely devastating for the Germans, who were pushed back to their lines from 1916. At this point, the Germans were giving up hope. They were demoralized, starved, tired, you name it. Ludendorff wrote to the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, stating that Germany no longer had the power to fight the war, and that they should just consider surrender. In response, a council was held at the city of Spa in Belgium. In the end, the Germans concluded that there was no way that they would be able to win the war offensively. So, they focused on bunkering down their defensive line, known as the Hindenburg Line, which they hoped would eventually wear down France until they surrendered. Taking advantage of Germany's switch to defense, the Allies launched what is known to be the last offensive of the war, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. On September 26, 1918, American forces coming from Verdun and French forces from Champagne began their way towards Mézières, where they hoped to intersect. Mézières was the site of a major German railway and the hinge to the Antwerp-Meuse defensive line, so it was extremely strategic for the Allies to capture. Meanwhile, the British fought along the Hindenburg defensive line beginning on September 27th, and the Belgians fought to retake the city of Ghent beginning on September 28th. Meanwhile, the Central Powers were slowly but surely being picked off by the Allies. It started with Bulgaria, who surrendered after a long Allied campaign on September 29th, 1918. Almost exactly a month later, on October 30th, 1918, the Ottomans capitulated, vocab word, as well after the British had taken their holdings in Palestine and Mesopotamia, and were threatening the Ottoman homeland after Bulgaria surrendered. The terms put down by the treaty, known as the Armistice of Mudros, effectively ended the centuries-long Ottoman Empire forever. Going back to the Western Front, the American and French forces had failed to reach their goal of Mézières, while the British had broken down the German defense but were not able to pursue them fast enough during their withdrawal. Even though the offensive hadn't achieved all of its goals, it still really shivered the timbers of the Germans, who started to request an armistice. Now, with all of this chaos going on with the Central Powers, let's see how Austria-Hungary is doing, and oh my god, what the heck is that? Throughout 1917 and 1918, dissent had been growing within the minorities in the confines of the empire. This dissent was helped in part by the Russian Revolution of 1917, which brought the guy who apparently looks like me, Vladimir Lenin, to power, and instated a communist Russian government. On October 5th, 1918, a council made up of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes convened in the city of Zagreb, claiming to represent all southern Slavs in the empire. Soon after, the Romanians and Poles followed. Austro-Hungarian Emperor Charles I, seeing where this was going, allowed the minorities to have their own governments, but they still each had to be a part of the empire and take orders from Austria. The minority governments looked at this and said, yeah, no, and proceeded to do the exact opposite. On October 17th, Hungary declared independence, and 11 days later, so did the Czechs and Slovaks, uniting to create the coolest-sounding country of all time, Czechoslovakia. With the country falling apart, Charles I had no choice but to sign a treaty with the Allies on November 3rd, 1918 at Villa Giusti, effectively bringing them out of the war. Well, so far we have two countries that have fallen due to rebellion. Now it's time to add another one, Germany. What started as a small naval mutiny on the port city of Kiel erupted into a major revolution, forcing Kaiser Wilhelm II to abdicate his throne on November 9th. Chancellor Friedrich Ebert succeeded Wilhelm as leader of Germany, with the country finally surrendering on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918 at a clearing in the Compiègne forest in France. The war technically didn't end until June 28th, 1919, when the Treaty of Versailles was signed, but the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month sounds better. Speaking of that treaty, it was absolutely crippling for Germany. It was forced to give up 10% of its pre-war territory, including its overseas colonies, had to pay $33 billion, had to reduce its military to only 100,000 people, could not make submarines, U-boats, tanks, or any kind of warfare machine, and their arms production was massively reduced. The other Central Powers had received harsh punishments, but none as harsh as those placed on Germany. All in all, around 21.5 million people died over the course of the war, with 8.5 million of which being soldiers and the other 13 million being civilians. For soldiers, the main killer was artillery, while for civilians it varied, but was mostly due to starvation, exposure, military encounters, and massacres. In response to this horrible war, the League of Nations was formed to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. And nothing like this ever did happen again. The world lived in sunshine and rainbows, and we all got along and watched Cobra Kai together. Yep, nothing bad ever happened ever again. The end.